and welcome everybody. My name's Bhante Akaliko and I use he, him pronouns. I'm a queer Buddhist monk and the founder of Rainbodhi LGBTQIA+ Buddhist community. And you're very welcome here today for this, our fourth session of our Compassionate Queers program. Today, I'm on Barramadagal land of the Darug Nation here in Sydney, Australia, and I'd just like to acknowledge this land. This land has never been ceded. It is, was, and always will be Aboriginal land. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and I'd like to extend that respect and that acknowledgement of the legacies of colonialism to all First Nations people on the call and First Nations people everywhere. So we've been meeting compassionate queers from all around the world in this series, and today we have two speakers from Australia and one speaker from the UK. And I'll introduce them in a little bit, but just to let you know, firstly, if you're not already familiar with Rainbodhi, we're a spiritual friendship group that is non-sectarian. We welcome everyone, regardless of which school of Buddhism you come from, whether you're Buddhist or not. We welcome everyone regardless of race, regardless of gender, regardless of sexuality, ability, whether you're rich or poor, we welcome you. And I mean that when I say you are welcome here and you belong, and that whoever you are cared for and loved. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you for being a part of Rainbodhi. And I'd like us to begin by doing a few minutes of meditation with our first guest speaker. Her name is Venerable Bom Hyon Sunim. So I'll just introduce Sunim briefly to you. She's a good friend of mine, one of the first monastics that I met after becoming a monk, and who inspired me with her compassion. She works as a chaplain in university environments, as well as with the Defence Forces. She is a person who is interested in spiritual care and what it means. She's currently researching her PhD, good on you, Sunim, better you than me, into spiritual care practices in universities. She founded spiritual care facilities in Tasmania and in Melbourne. And it's really great to have her here today to share a little bit about her journey in life and what it means to be a queer Buddhist, perhaps, and what it means to think about spiritual care. So please welcome Sunim to give us a short meditation just to help us all arrive and settle.
So thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me, Bhante Akaliko, to be part of such an auspicious gathering of community and people today. And I just want to start by acknowledging the Gundagura and Tarawa people as the traditional custodians of the land where I'm zooming in from, and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'm just going to do a short meditative reflection with you, and this comes from my own tradition. The Korean Son or Zen tradition, well, actually the practice is not necessarily directly from there, but it is a Zen style practice. So there's a wonderful Zen phrase, not knowing is the most intimate. Not knowing can awaken our curiosity. It can open us and even, bring joy into our hearts and lives. And there's a certain sweetness and a certain relief in not knowing, in being present and letting things come and go. Impermanence and interdependence, as we know, are the core of the Buddhist teachings, but they're not simply to be memorised. They're to be applied in our daily life experiences. So when we're caught in our mind projections, confusion, ignorance, there's a simple practice that we can use to return to this intimacy of not knowing. And it has an acronym, BRACE. Breathe, relax, ask, cool, explore. So let's try it. So the first step is to bring your attention to the breath. This is a very simple way to shift your mind away from thinking, to give yourself the space to reflect and to see in a different way. So bring attention to the breath and take a moment to just breathe. Awareness of breath. There are often signs in our body when we're stuck in some thinking or emotion or just some sort of dogged certainty. There often you can see it in your shoulders, tension around the eyes, the neck, the abdomen, in pretty much anywhere in the body. So take a little time to relax the whole body. And notice how this relaxing of the body also helps to relax the mind. In the space between our perceptions and reality, an ocean of ignorance and suffering can arise in our mind, in our body. And so it's very easy for us to fall into stories, projections, cravings, delusion, reaction. And it's good for us to be able to ask ourselves in this moment of stillness and quieting the mind, is there something I'm holding on to? Is there something I'm holding on to that stops me from moving into the not knowing, which is most intimate? Letting yourself cool and settle into a deeper breath and whole body awareness. Allowing the cooling to soothe any agitation or pain in body, mind. And resting in this intimacy of not knowing. You may want to take a moment just to explore any emotions or feelings that are stirring in you. And to ask yourself, what do these emotions, these feelings want to say to you? And what are you neglecting? Then let yourself just settle into a more expansive inner space, opening or to widening to the boundlessness of what we are. Relaxing then for a few moments in the intimacy of not knowing. So now everyone's settled into the not knowing mind. Let's begin. So I just wanted to start today by making reference to an article that I came across recently in Schwartz Media's Saturday paper. And it was actually an interview with Shane Jenick, some of you may know. He's a Brisbane boy, and he moved to Sydney in 2000 and auditioned for Australian Idol in 2003. And his first audition was a very polite rejection. But he turned up the next night in drag as his alter ego, Courtney Act, who I'm sure some of you have heard of. And of course, the judges loved him. He ended up touring with the finalists, and one of the judges, Dickie as he was known, Ian Dixon, signed him up to his record label. So 2 decades on, Courtney Act is a well-known drag act in Australia and in the world. But at the time of this interview, Janek was rehearsing for a major role in Blythe's Spirit, a Noel Coward play, which is opening soon at the Sydney Opera House. And in this play, he actually has the leading female role, but it's not a drag act. And the promotional material makes no reference to his gender or his sexual identity. And for Shane Courtney, this has been coming full circle in a way where he really appreciates that, he is respected for something more than just the persona that he presents to the world. So like many queers, his teenage years were marked by bullying and suicide ideation. And for Shane, this happened before he was 11 years old. He describes his early gender confusion and queer harassment as immense suffering, and particularly from having to break free from the status quo and the relative comfort of the heteronormative community, which I'm sure many of us have experienced. But over the decades, he also came to understand the positive of this suffering and how it helped to shape his resilience and diversity. And although my own story is quite different from Shane's, I too experienced confusion, shame, self-harm in my teen years, until in the early 20s, I began to meditate and to understand a little more of why I'd undergone this same immense suffering that Shane speaks of. And I too, in time, came to appreciate the fruits of resilience and diversity from this experience. So I came of age in the late 60s and 70s, and this was the age of the second wave of feminism. And so the women's liberation movement was there on my doorstep. And dykes, as we called ourselves back then, we were out in the public arena, not necessarily embraced by the society, mind you, but neither at this point in history were we dependent on the hetero male acceptance. We had access at that time to free education, free university education. Jobs were plentiful, and overseas travel and work experience was a rite of passage for us. Now, I want to acknowledge that this is from my experience and hugely due to the privilege of being white and middle class. I acknowledge that there were many people, and still are many people, who are excluded from the sort of opportunities that I had then and I've had in my life. So during those years, there was a great camaraderie among the women who were part of that life. We lived together in community. We learned together, we shared together, we grew together, and we protested together against all manner of injustices: the right to own our own bodies, reproductive rights, legalised free abortion, affordable childcare, equal pay and job opportunities, and the prevention of rape and family violence. And I was fortunate to be engaged in those early collectives that were set up to establish the first domestic violence refuges in Australia. That was a great learning for me, and also really, to some extent, a formative experience for me in appreciating the importance of compassion in that whole period for myself and for others. And now, nearly 50 years on, I find myself back in the university classroom teaching family violence. So it's interesting karma. But it was not all beer and skittles, as they say, and some of us in those early years found ourselves in police cells on more than one occasion. But most of us were fortunate in not being marked with a serious criminal record. And when I speak of this, I speak particularly of the women, dykes and women who were part of that movement. And that's, I think, partly due to good old Queen Vic's lack of imagination, which, she wasn't able to imagine women participating in such intimate relationships with each other. But I grew up in Tasmania, and Tasmania, as many of you will know, was the last state in Australia to legalise homosexuality. And this, in fact, didn't happen until 1997, so fairly recent in our imagination. So, while the Tassie hetero males, found us dykes fairly offensive, shameless and lawless, we weren't so viscerally threatened. They weren't so viscerally threatened by us as they were by the idea of homosexual males. So, I understand and and have compassion for the males, the homosexuals in that dark period of our history. But in fact, there was a precedence long before this time in Tasmania among the colonial masters, when Bass and Flinders, you may know of them, I'm sure people my age learnt about them in our school history, and they circumnavigated Van Diemen's Land, as Tasmania was then known. And Flinders recorded in his logbook of Bass, there was a time when I was so completely wrapped in you that no conversation but yours could give me pleasure. Your footsteps upon the quarterdeck over my head took me from book and brought me upon the deck to walk with you. I'm not sure that was, I think that's been latterly brought to notice, and I think it was brought to notice probably by Rodney Croom, who was one of the main activists in Tasmania for the change of legislation. So it's an early precedence, really. But now returning to Shane Jenic's story, for Shane, drag was initially an opportunity to perform, as, like many of us, he'd always loved performing. And if that was all it was, it took him a long time to realise that he could have found other opportunities to do so, to perform without having to put on women's clothing. But it wasn't until a couple of decades later, in fact, when he met trans activist Shaz Bono, who introduced him to the term fluid identity or gender fluid. And then something clicked for him. This was a moment of instant identification and validation for him, and it explained a deep and fundamental part of who he was. So I'd also taken an early path in the performing arts, and attending an all-girls school, I was able to play the roles of both female and males. And I was very comfortable with that, as long as it was on the stage, of course. What I understood about myself much later in life was that there was an ease that I experienced in this kind of shape-shifting, a fluidity of identity, and a deep discomfort with being pigeonholed as any one identity. And Shane describes himself in this interview. He says, although the two, Shane and Courtney, look different, it's just me in a different outfit. But he does use different pronouns, she, he, when presenting in different guises. So in the time remaining, I want to talk about identity, a little bit about identity, and how that impacts on our response to situations that we find ourselves in, and on the sphere of our engagement in community and beyond. So often in our yearning to belong, and I was no different in that respect, we claim an identity and we think we've chosen it. We see it as us, and we see it as our freedom to choose. But unfortunately, the cult of the individual in these times will suck us dry. These days, authenticity for me doesn't come from an identity perspective, but from a deeper, wider, and more authentic ground of intimacy that manifests as compassion and kindness as I continue to own and grow in this space. So touching again into our suffering, it's important for us as followers of the Buddhist path to remember that the teaching of karma erases the responsibilities of our typical self-definition. Our presence together with others, our sharing of a particular world and history is already evidence that we meaningfully belong together. We're not present together by accident. Neither are we present together because of some objective fate or destiny that transcends our personal sense of the meaning of things. The First Noble Truth invites us to recognise the fact that I'm okay doesn't necessarily mean that you're okay. When we realise that our situation as a whole is troubled and suffering, there's an opening in us to see that from a present perspective, there are many things that are not going well. The Second Noble Truth suggests that if we look closely enough, we discover there's a pattern in things that are going wrong. And we're almost certainly at least part of the reason why. And this, of course, is counterintuitive to the conditioned view, which sees that the trouble happens out there. Someone else is causing it. And yet the Second Noble Truth calls us to see things differently. Unlike pain, dukkha, which is often translated as suffering, unsatisfactoriness, it doesn't arise from a single cause. It arises through a network of specific situation, interdependent conditions. So if we think of two children running across the playground, having a race, and the boy, for example, this is a boy and a girl, forgive me, the traditional gender, but it's a boy and a girl. And the girl is in front faster and the boy is coming up behind, but he's close enough to grab the girl's shirt. And as he does that, the girl loses her balance and falls to the ground, scraping her knees and her arms, and beginning to cry. So her elbows are bleeding and she's pretty unhappy. We can perhaps explain this event in a linear causative way. As you can imagine, I won't go into that, use your imagination, I don't have time. But what if a boy is the girl's best friend? The girl will suffer much more than the bodily pain of physical injury. And she'll suffer from the fact that, she wonders why this boy, her best friend, has cheated on her just to win a playground race. We know best friends are not supposed to do that, don't we? Days, months, years later, she'll likely be affected by that betrayal of basic trust. So suffering is real, but like all things, it arises conditionally as part of a pattern of interdependence in which we always play a part. The third noble truth asked us to see that we're always in a position to be part of the resolution, restoring the middle ground of our interdependence with all things, healing the wound of existence that is our essential separateness from each other and from all things. And this is something that only we can do. Hence the fourth noble truth, which points to the Eightfold Noble Path. So the first step in resolving the conflicts so characteristic of our shared lives is realising the absence of any absolute boundaries separating us from our situations, and the possibility of completely revising this meaning and directing our attention away from samsara to nirvana. And in realising this absence of boundaries, we see that we cannot truly save any one being without saving each other, saving all beings. This, of course, is a teaching of karma that reveals the bodhisattva vow of liberating all sentient beings as the root condition for realising any liberation at all. The limitless positive and liberating qualities of a Buddha don't transcend our familiar world. They're always and everywhere present within it. And so the movement in the direction of liberation, or nirvana as we call it, is part of the nature of all things, including each of us. And it only requires a method or a practice on our part to actualise and demonstrate this. So Buddhist practice focuses on giving situationally and critically responsive form to the emptiness of interdependence of all things by both acknowledging our circumstances and the commonality of our circumstances and skillfully contributing to the expression of a truly liberating intimacy among all beings. Not only is suffering without any essence and so dependent on time and place, but so too is the end of suffering or liberation. And far from it being something privately attained and experienced, enlightenment is best seen as the opening of an inimitable intimacy through which we're continually liberated from the arrogance of both self and other. Enlightenment must be understood as irreducibly social, and it can never be merely mine or yours. It's only ever realised as ours. And so this is really the challenge for us as a community that comes together in this way. Your suffering is my suffering. Your liberation is my liberation. And so among the partying and the experiences of great experiences that we've had in the past and have together now as a community of queers, it's also important that we recognise, that we do have, this great responsibility to each other to share our compassion and care and love for each other. So thank you.
Thank you, Sunim. That was deep and beautiful, and I thank you for taking the time to share with us tonight. I know that this is one of the few times that you've directly addressed a queer Buddhist audience, and I just want to thank you for opening that part of yourself up to help.
And could I also just say, Bhante, that I did share with Bhante recently. So, my queer experience goes back a long way, but because I'm 70, it was a different experience. But then I stepped into robes, and in robes, it wasn't something that I talked about or even thought that much about, to be quite honest. And it wasn't something that could be part of my life living in monasteries in Asian countries. So I was very pleased that Bhante some time ago invited me into the Rainbodhi circle. And this time has been a really precious time for me to reclaim that part of myself. It's not that I'd abandoned it, not that I, denied it. It's just that, now I can bring it back into the wholeness of who I am in a community celebratory way. So thank you, Bhante Akaliko, for that opportunity.
It's my pleasure, and it's the same kind of opportunity that Rainbodhi wants to give to everybody, so that they can bring these really important parts of themselves into their spiritual life a little bit more, because our queerness and our spiritual life is inseparable. And so I want to both make a safe place and a celebratory space where we can acknowledge these parts of ourselves and hold them together for everyone. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. And I'd like to go to our next speaker, who is Venerable Chokyi. Venerable Chokyi is giving us a lesson in impermanence. I think looking at the biography I wrote about you a little while back, so many things have now changed. So Venerable is currently living in Hayagriva Monastery in Western Australia, but she's well known on the east coast of Australia for her work in Chenrezig and also at the Vajrayana Institute, or Foundation for the Preservation of the Mahayana Tradition Monasteries and Centres. She was previously, up until last week, the chairperson of the Australian Sangha Association, a position also held by our previous speaker, Venerable Bom Hyon Sunim. So it's wonderful to have such people of high calibre on the call. And one of the projects that is really close to Venerable Chokyi's heart is the Liberation Prison Project. She's been the international director of for over 10 years and will soon, with any luck, be stepping down from that role. But that organisation has helped over 22,000 people in jails find some peace through meditation practice. And it's a beautiful initiative, and I welcome Venerable Chokyi to give us an insight into her life, her practice, and some of the work that she does. Thank you so much, Venerable, being here tonight.
First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation here in WA, and to really pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, to have maintained this space for us to live and engage in our practice and study and everything that we do in life, you know, over 45,000, 50,000, however many thousand years. And I say that from my heart because up until actually when I ordained, I was working and had been working for some time with Indigenous people, Indigenous nations in Australia, and had been coordinating the academic program for Nurragili, the Indigenous unit at University of New South Wales. And interestingly enough, when I did present myself for ordination, I thought, well, I'm giving up that academic life, so I won't be needing that PhD I had started. And actually, my spiritual director, my abbot, said, no, you need to do this. This is important. You know, the whole research into deep meditative practice amongst Indigenous nations in Australia and amongst Buddhist practitioners, but also seeing I first started out looking at notions of well-being in Indigenous cultures. So it's something that I'm still deeply involved in exploring. So I too was part of the whole, I guess, queer movement, the women's liberation movement in the early 70s. And I was in Canberra at ANU when I first went to university, and Australian National University, and involved in setting up of rape crisis centres and so forth. We'd spend our Friday night in town and, you know, letting people know out there on the street and so forth. And then in Melbourne with the establishment of the women's, not the establishment of women's liberation, but the establishment of the Women's House. I think we said we took 6 months to find the building and another 6 months to just decide how to spell women. But also setting up refuges there in Melbourne, and then later being involved with that as an educator in Sydney, coming back into that space much later. And from the beginnings of, you know, what we now celebrate as Mardi Gras, of, you know, going from that time of protest out on the street where you're fearful of being locked up and so forth with the police on the outside, to now seeing that is now a celebrated space in our history. And it's quite different, you know, over those intervening years. But good to see that we have finally, and this is where, you know, for the tiniest little contribution I may have been part of in marriage equality and at least promoting that awareness, you know, so that's been really important. I grew up in Newcastle and went to also to a girls' school where maybe a year before I went to the school, 2 girls had been thrown out for being lesbian, and they defiantly walked across the school playground, you know, arm in arm, kissing as their departing gesture. And so it wasn't a place, it wasn't till much later that I actually realised there were other lesbian students at that school, because we encountered each other in all sorts of places subsequently. But that was a time of isolation. And I guess, you know, I was fortunate to encounter the Buddhist teachings while I was in Canberra, but I really got actively involved when I was in Sydney. And I have to say, I never felt unwelcome. You know, being Sydney, I never felt unwelcome. Again, it wasn't something that was necessarily explicitly talked about, but there were, there were gay, lesbian, transgender brothers, sisters, or non-brother sisters, people there. And however, for me, I think what was really important was hearing a teacher talk about identifying as lesbian, hearing an ordained Sangha member talk in that way. And here was someone you could ask questions of. And here was someone, that just acknowledged that history. And I think that's really important as a teacher now here. Then it's really, I find it really, really important that that is part of my story, and my story isn't hidden, of being honest, being open, being genuine, being authentic. It's part of who I am. When I did ordain, I wasn't overtly talking anything about LGBTQIA plus, and really felt like, now you're going into transitioning into a different mode in this spiritual life. And I think it happens in an early ordination. I think that they're sort of, you're wanting to, do the right thing and so forth. Not that I'm not wanting to do the right thing now, but to come to some, which I had previously, some sort of just comfort in being who I am. So while still Buddhist, I supported a friend of mine who was transitioning from male to female. He subsequently became part of running the Gender Centre in Sydney, which I think has become, he said it's quite different now. And he did invite me to join the board. And I thought, I'm a Buddhist nun. Is that appropriate to join the board? I didn't, but I could have, I think I also didn't want to take on another committee. But through that experience of supporting him, I learned a lot about the transgender community, and not just transgender, intersex, and the whole gender fluidity in Sydney. I met with a lot of people, heard a lot of people's stories and so forth. And as it's always been forever in history, gender is not something really so fixed, let alone sexual identity. And then also when I knew I was I felt that I was preparing for ordination, let's say that it was started to become, my preoccupation in my mind, it just seemed to have ripened. I then left the Sydney Gay and Lesbian Choir, which again was representative of all the sort of whole gender fluid spectrum. And I was really conscious of the fact that there were stories of people in that choir who had left particular religions because of not being accepted. And we had the Metropolitan Community Church in Sydney, but I thought that was a bit Christian for me, or not my tradition, not my faith. And of course, we would have the meditation retreat days, once a year during Mardi Gras, or for Buddhists, for queer Buddhists and so forth. Or I think there might have been a group at the Buddhist Council as well. And so for me now, as a teacher, I have to reflect at the fact that the Buddha was incredibly radical, at that time in India. If we think about the Buddha coming from a Brahmin caste, that predominantly it was exclusively males of the Brahmin class who could engage in any sort of spiritual learning and practice to any great extent, any significant extent. And then what did the Buddha do? The Buddha practiced non-discrimination, practiced inclusivity of absolutely everybody, or, very strict caste system, but cutting across that, inviting all people, all castes, male, female, ordained, fully ordaining women and men and so forth. And so we have that role model from the Buddha. And so it's like an obligation to uphold that sort of role model. You know, the Buddha was radical then. If the Buddha was alive today, he would be radical now, and we'd be out there involved in all the sorts of social movements. And this has really been my journey. I've always been involved in areas of social justice, whether that be from working with refugees, migrant women, Indigenous people. And now seeing that with, you know, for quite some time, my history of working with people in prison through Liberation Prison Project, you know, and sort of managing that worldwide, and seeing transformation happen. And seeing transformation happen also within the system. So the transformation of people's minds in prison, where all of a sudden the officers are saying, oh, we love it when you come here because, you know, these people, they're incarcerated, they're angry, they want to change the system. You come in here, they watch their breath and they want to, you know, sort of help everybody. They get very calm and very kind and very loving, and a sense of hope. And so it's seeing the sort of research that's been done in that space as well about the power of, I don't have to mention the power of practice, but I figure it's been inspiring for me, because I think, you know, out of all the disadvantaged groups I've worked with, or the ones of marginalized communities, seeing people in prison is quite profound, really had very limited education, very little opportunities, and they grab the Dharma within such intensity. And it's like they know what it's been like to be just unbearably suffering, and to see that there's some sort of light of hope, which is probably why most people come to the Buddhist Centre in the first place, to the Dharma Centre in the first place. So then when I was preparing or thinking about today, not much preparation, but thinking about today and this conversation we're having, you know, I gave a talk here at Hayagriva Buddhist Centre on Friday night. They asked me to do like socially engaged Buddhism, which was actually what was my first entry point into Buddhism as well. And, you know, I presented on the welcoming the rainbow and talked about Rainbodhi and so forth. And it was really beneficial to people there to feel suddenly like, you know, one gentleman said, he said, I don't know any other teacher who actually is open about acceptance of gender fluidity or whatever, gender identification. And I really love that. We're now talking about making it very explicit with, I said, it's all very well to say we don't discriminate, but people have to feel welcome. So I said, we need a rainbow flag, and we need the rainbow heart. We need to let people know this is a safe place. We need to, you know, be all, not that people explicitly are being exclusionary, but we have to look at, you know, as it says in Welcoming Rainbow, I looked at all those dot points and I think, I don't think we do that. I don't think we do that. And this is something that I can see is a big part of my role here, and something I can have influence on. I found working in the prisons as well, as I said, it's organisationally it's changed. You know, last time I was in Victoria last year, visiting a prison, and there was one prisoner who was transitioning from male to female identification within a male prison. Unfortunately, we haven't quite got to the point they say, there you go, scoot over to the women's prison, but at least having the acceptance, or what I perceived to be acceptance. And she did indeed say she felt accepted there by other inmates, but also by the staff there. So that was really, really very heartwarming to see, because these were conversations we were having way back. You know, what happens when a transgender person ends up in a prison system, like, you know, why can't they go here and why can't they go there? And, you know, I think when I first, 2015, I think I was in flying over to the US and got off the plane at San Francisco, and it had the toilets had the images of, you know, a man, a woman, and then one with the half skirt and long leg, and a baby, and it's just said, anybody of any gender identification, welcome. That's it. You know, you don't have to label yourself one or the other thing, just everyone's welcome. And I think for me, we have to also, you know, I sort of thought, here, we still have our male toilets and female toilets. So this is going to be a work in progress. I said, right, this has got to change. And, you know, it's 2021. So that's something else I wanted to just mention there. Yeah, so the fact that as a teacher and having a certain responsibility and now being labelled senior Sangha, I think it just means you've got older. Oh yeah, it is 2022. Thanks for reminding me. I'm so last year. You know, people like, just before I left Queensland, Chenrezig Institute, one of my dear friends who has 2 children, and both were raised as boys, and one started identifying as female, and so they were connected with our Buddhist Centre. So of course she wanted to introduce me to now her daughter, newly, and for us. And it was really, for me, I can support in this space. I have supported in this space, and I come from experience in that, and that this is part of the welcoming. And then when I was leaving, this, you know, young woman who, you know, was still transitioning was welcomed by the abbot, just as previously, like, there's no big deal. You know, I sometimes think I often think our lamas, our, you know, Tibetan lamas or whatever tradition we follow, are way ahead of the rest of us. Like, their minds are much more expansive and inclusive. And this was also what I found working in Indigenous education. We had I think sometime in the 90s, it was the International Indigenous Education Conference in Wollongong. And the next one was going to be held in Canada. And the one in Wollongong, a dear friend of mine, lesbian and with a big role in the Indigenous education, you know, first one to get a PhD, and the first Indigenous person to get a PhD in education in New South Wales, was not allowed to present a paper about gender diversity. She wasn't allowed to. She was prevented from doing that. And then the incoming Indigenous nation in Canada said, well, we welcome everybody. We regard, if you're intersex, if you're, you know, if you're lesbian, gay, transgender, you're actually special people in our community. You have a double helix, and that's much more regarded with higher esteem. So just to think that culturally it can be quite different, I think and so this informs my spiritual practice, because I have to, like my teachers, have such an expansive, or work on having such an expansive mind and opening up to that, opening up the conversation. Because until we open up the conversation and make it really explicit in our centres, will people still feel welcome? And this, you know, feedback from this one person, one student the other night was great to see. It wasn't that he was saying that he didn't feel welcome. It was saying, I don't have these role models, and I needed those role models, or I had those role models as teachers. And so I think, you know, and I've often had that case of, you know, people coming to me because they recognise they can feel comfortable talking about all sorts of gender issues, and that I'll be very open. And I think that's, you know, it's been a great gift of having Rainbodhi. I'm not sure how much time I've got there. My only regret that was that we didn't get to launch Rainbodhi in Queensland in June 2020, along with the Sakyadhita conference, the Buddhist Women's Conference. And so we were planning to do that then. And of course, COVID took care of that. We were in lockdown at the time, but there's still that space and there's still opportunity. So now with these connections the other night, I think we're planning the Pride, our participation in Pride WA in November. Because also I thought, you know, I too was sort of like, oh, now I'm ordained, I don't do those things anymore. I don't party, but I think we can still go in the parade, just not allowed to dance. That's okay. I've had enough of being a dancing girl in the parade, and those days are over for sure. The body won't allow it. But, you know, we see these days that those churches that may have previously excluded people are actually fully participating. Those police that were on the outside or on the inside fully participating. And I say to myself, and where are we as Buddhists, you know? Where's our, not that I need to, I don't need to, my partying days are over. I don't need it. But what message are we giving to the broader community? And I think it's really, really important to keep that message out there in the public and not hidden behind, you know, sort of whispers and you know, or don't, you know, hush, keep it quiet. So for me, I guess it's sort of, I've found my space with my gender identity, with my sexuality. And of course we go, oh, but, you know, you become celibate, so it's irrelevant. Who you are is not irrelevant. And so to be able to feel comfortable in that space all these years on as an ordained Sangha, as a teacher, and, you know, be fully claiming my identity. And I really wish Rainbodhi very well, and hope that we continue to have these conversations and look at, you know, more that we can do together. I know it's very important for me also on the Sakyadhita committee as well, to be always keeping this alive. And particularly as we've seen in New South Wales, in Australia, that whole rolling back, that whole threat with the amendments to the religious discrimination bill that seemed to target, particularly now the conversation I think halted when it was like we couldn't agree, or the politicians couldn't agree in relation to transgender and in schools and so forth. So I think we've still got a long way to go, but we have also come a long way. And it's really been a huge part of my spiritual journey, my spiritual practice, and continues to be. So I think I can leave it there, and I'm sure I've gone over time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Venerable. Such a pleasure. And I really do want to express, without putting too fine a point on it, that I'm very happy to have our queer Buddhist elders with us here today. I say that meaning it as a compliment, and I hope that you understand the importance to middle-aged queers like me, and to younger queer Buddhists as well, how important it is that we see ourselves reflected throughout our institutions and traditions. And thank you for the work that you've both done in various protest movements, working with women especially, and trying to create a safer, better world for us all. So thank you for that. And I feel like I'm moving on to a new generation here, but our next speaker is Kez. Kez is from the UK and is an integrative therapist working with mindfulness and especially supporting the queer community. He works with queer community around the world and provides trauma counselling and also helps with human rights development. Kez works especially with people and has spoken about this and is constantly compassionately supporting our queer family in the Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya, which is often a hostile place for our queer family. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about the Kakuma refugee camp and how we can support this kind of work to make sure that our queer friends and family are safe in such environments. But before that, I just want to let you know that Kez also has an interest in clowning which is something that made me smile as well. So thank you so much for being here today, Kez, and I really look forward to hearing about your life and the work that you do.
Thank you, Kaliko, and wow, what a wonderful space to be joining today with all of you here. I feel really, really privileged and honoured to be able to share my voice. My intention is to really just share from my heart about where I'm at right now with these thoughts about queer identity, Buddhism, and the work that I'm doing in the world. And I hope that it waters some seeds of wholesomeness to listen. But also, please forgive me if I veer off or say anything that doesn't make sense, because I'm not really a professional speaker. I just kind of am here to share from my heart. I grew up queer in the UK, in the Midlands, in a small suburban town, and it was, life was quite hard there for me. I had all the kind of typical family issues, some quite dramatic, and also kind of living with the legacy of kind of working class oppression in my area as well. But on top of that, I think one of the things that LGBTQIA plus people have to face is that additional level of oppression, persecution. So I grew up with that. And as part of my journey has been understanding intersectionality, and also about my privilege as a white person. And I think particularly a few years ago, I started to think a bit more deeply about that, and about kind of the effect of Britain on the world, and many other white European countries. And so I guess I've been doing a lot of reflection on what it means to be white, and all of the ways in which white ancestors have harmed people in black and brown bodies around the world. And so I think a part of my motivation to work with African people was, in a way, to just kind of to understand, and to kind of, in some kind of symbolic way, kind of make amends. But also I felt that there's a very strong way that I can identify and understand some of the oppression that people may be experiencing. So that was kind of why I was drawn to work online with LGBTQ people in Kakuma Camp. Kakuma Camp is it's a huge camp. There are about 300,000 people there in Kenya. Kakuma means nowhere in the local language, and it really is nowhere. It's in the desert. It's very even the weather is very extreme, and it really strikes me that that it exists, that these people have so many people have been kind of forced really to stay on that camp after having fled very difficult circumstances. And it really saddens me today to know that so few people have left that camp since it was started over 20 years ago. There have been generations of people who have grown up there, and I'm also really aware of today the huge support in my local area for Ukrainian refugees, which is wonderful. And I think it's really easy to relate to people who maybe look and think a bit like the dominant culture, but maybe it's also an extra step to kind of look a bit more deeply and to wonder why there are so many forgotten people, really, in a refugee camp in Kakuma. And I think that has something to do with unconscious racism and maybe outright racism. So I spent my time counselling mainly, and also doing some empowerment workshops, working particularly with the men. I've got quite a diverse team of counsellors and therapists. And listening for me was quite a deep practice. To really hold a space for other people to feel safe in, to share is such a wonderful gift, to be able to do that. As I listened, I learned more of people's individual stories, and just how profoundly traumatic they were. And so what actually some of the ways that we help to stay safe in those conversations was through Buddhist practice. Introduced compassion meditation, really inviting people to kind of stay with their heart and soften their feelings to their experiences, and it's something very, very helpful to them. And I really had to take care of myself too, over particularly the beginning, because it was like a whole rush of new information about this area of work. And so self-care became really important. I'd go for lots of long walks, connecting with nature, connecting with the earth. And, so I really became aware of how it's possible to suffer very deeply just through listening to other people suffering. The very sad fact about Kakuma is that LGBTQIA+ people have fled extreme violence in their home countries, places like Uganda, Burundi, Somalia, even Kenya itself, and ended up on a camp in hopes for safety. They appealed to the UN, to the Red Cross, and they were sent to the camp. And there are a lot of traumatized people on the camp, people very hurt, who've been through wars, who have their human rights denied, don't have much education, not really very much medical care, and just very, very deep wounds, which I think maybe damages people's idea, ability to self-reflect and to grow and to heal. And so there is extreme violence against LGBTQIA+ people there, which is specifically targeted because of queer identity. And even if it's not violence happening, there is kind of ongoing kind of cumulative stress of being othered, being made to feel unwelcome in shops, just engaging with neighbours, even at the local water point. It's dangerous, really, for LGBTQI+ people to go to collect water to live on, because if they're seen, if they're close to people who are outside of that small community, they're likely to be harmed, because particularly LGBTQIA plus people are mainly from Uganda, and so it's quite easy to identify people from Uganda on the camp because they have different way of speaking, and they look a little bit different to the majority of Somalian refugees. And it's widely known that people fleeing from Uganda are fleeing because of legislation that is against LGBTQI plus people. Yeah, it's not only that they're fleeing, it's the way their families treat them. And some have lost partners to murder. And so they're fleeing for their lives. And yeah, so that's quite a lot of information. I don't want to overwhelm anyone because it even feels quite stressful for me to think about it. And it's really been a part of my practice to try to soothe myself so that I can be present enough to, because really it's enraging, and it's deeply sad, and it really changed my worldview as well to have learned just how deeply our friends are suffering there. And they live in a block called Block 13. And the campaign is to free Block 13 because mass evacuation of LGBTQIA plus people seems to be the right way forwards. There's, in my opinion, quite little hope that LGBTQIA plus people will be able to integrate into the community there, but also it's meant to be a camp. It's not meant to be somewhere that people stay for their whole lives. And unfortunately, there have been LGBTQIA plus people who have lost their lives at that camp due to the violence. And it's not okay. So part of my practice has been writing to my MP, sending him a very kind letter, just really trying to get the message across, but do so in a respectful way. And similarly, I've been writing to the UN. I've had meetings with the UN through Zoom, and again, try to get my message across. But I think there's a kind of a willful denial, really, of the problem, which is, is deeply political, deeply biased towards other issues. And I just think this is one of the worst human rights crises on the planet right now. And it receives so little attention. It's been in the BBC News, particularly due to a protest that the LGBTQI plus people gave outside the UN offices, just to raise awareness of the violence. However, they were tear gassed and beaten, and including a mother with a baby, and the baby lost her life shortly afterwards due to the possibly tear gas inhalation. And it was after that protest that the Block 13 was actually set up for all of the LGBTQI plus people to be put together in one place. I don't know if that was the wisest thing to do, because they were living in isolation anyway, which is very vulnerable, but equally being together on a block makes them a kind of easy target to as a whole community. And there have been arson attacks and much much violence. So I guess before I continue, I'd just like to express some of the needs that are there at the camp, which is that people sleep on the earth at night, sometimes with thin mattresses and blankets, but there's very little shelter. And when it rains, they have to kind of pack in, standing up, sleeping in flooding shelters. So things like shelter are needed. They live on 1 meal a day, if that sometimes, because it's also very hard to even go to collect the food because of the violence that might break out. But equally, they only get small rations anyway. And the local clinic, there have been many instances of denial of services because of homophobia. People have gone there with wounds that they've received through the violent attacks, and been denied suitable care for that. So there are a team of activists around the world who are raising funds, in particular the Triangle Project, to try and pay for private medical care, because that seems to be the most effective way to get people treated when they really need it. And of course, there are many diseases that break out on the camp as well due to the low morale and the poor food and poor living conditions. So people are often getting very ill. So if you feel that you can, and it doesn't put you in any difficult position, then please do send something to the Triangle Project, whether it's a very small amount or as much as you feel able to give. And yeah, I guess I just also want to express my gratitude for the particular Buddhist community throughout my time supporting the Kokuma camp. It's been a real refuge for me to be able to sit with people who know the value of kindness, who know the value of non-violence very deeply, and embody that in thoughts and speech and actions, which is incredibly refreshing when working in such circumstances. And yeah, thank you for all being here today, and I'll hand you back over to Bhante Kaliko. Thank you.
Thank you, Kez. Thank you for sharing with us this incredibly challenging situation that these people are in. And I thank you for your advocacy. Also, I thank you for being the kind of person who has an open heart and who, despite seeing this suffering, is unflinching and continues to work in this way when most of us will look and move on. You know, it's so important that there's people like you who continually maintain that connection with this deep suffering and bring it to our attention so that we can work together to try to lessen it. And it does require a heavy heart, and hopefully many hands will make that work lighter. And so I do encourage people to donate, if you can, to the Triangle Project. And I know that there's other organizations as well working in Uganda, like Rainbow Riots, and many other groups, refugee groups around the world. And I really just want to thank you again, Kez, for being there for those people and for being here to share with us tonight. Thank you so much. We do have a few minutes if there's any questions that people ask. Yes, you are a brave and beautiful soul. Thank you, Joel, for reminding us. Yeah, you are a brave. It does take bravery and courage to look suffering in the eye. And I can imagine it just takes even so much more bravery for those people in the camp just to get up each day. If there's any questions that anyone has for our speakers, feel free to put them in the chat. We are almost running out of time, but I'd just like to give people the opportunity, if they have a question or if they have a comment, just to put it in the chat. In the meantime, I just wanted to thank our speakers, Venerable Bom Hyon Sunim, Venerable Chokyi, and almost Venerable, Venerable Hearted Kes, for being here and sharing with us tonight. And to thank all the speakers who have been part of this Compassionate Queers series. We've met people from all around the world, some of who are on the call today. So thank you for sharing with us your compassionate heart. And as Kes said, that it's so good to be around Buddhists who understand the value of kindness and compassion, and how fortunate we are to have spiritual friends like you to share with us and to encourage us to be more open-hearted and to love more and care more about our fellow living beings. And so if there's no questions, I'll move on to thanking our Zoom host, Kyle, for helping out with Zoom tonight. And shout out to Ben, I think we're watching this recording, who helped us out with Zoom every time we had a previous session for this series. And there's so many thanks in the chat as well, and people saying it's a powerful evening. It really was, and full of depth, and great to see that there's so many Buddhists who are compassionate both in heart and action. So I guess that's it. Please do look at the links provided for the Triangle Project and also the Prison Liberation Project. Encourage your friends to find out about our queer family around the world and in prisons, who in refugee camps, who are in need, and encourage people to engage in generosity and compassion to help make real meaningful difference to these people's lives. And thank you to everyone who's been joining and being part of the series. It's great to see you here, and I hope that it's been meaningful to you and that it has an impact in your life. And I wish you all the very best. May you be happy, may you be well, may you be safe, and may we all see each other soon online or in real life, and all the best to you all.